gave this talk in Sea Week earlier this year. You might not have heard about Sea Week. I think it's New Zealand wide. It happens once a year, and they have a week of events. And I've been giving a talk to Sea Week for about the last 4 or 5 years, doing a different topic each year. So last year I was thinking, what don't I know much about that I can present as a topic to Sea Week? And I thought, well, corals, I know something about them. I've heard that they're under threat. I know something relatively superficial about their biology. So I did the usual reading for a few months and put together this PowerPoint and gave it earlier in March to the general public during Sea Week. So all I'm saying this for is because I'm not an expert on corals. I've never done any research on corals, but the information I've gathered is just through interest. So Sea Week, the talk was at the WEA, the Workers' Educational Association in Christchurch. It was in an evening and I had 2 hours. So I went on for 2 hours. So to encourage you, I've taken about 40 of the slides out of the talk. So hopefully it'll fit into an hour. So here we go. That's what I hope to cover. I'll do it quite quickly. I don't know how much background you folk have got. Maybe relatively little about the biology of corals. Again, I'm sure you'll have heard that globally they're under threat because of warming of the oceans, acidification of the oceans. So that will be a theme later on in the talk. See how we go. So we'll start off with general biology. And as a biologist, we all like to know how organisms are classified in the general scheme of things. So I won't go into any great detail here, but a range of animals there which are related to corals. And of course, one of the photographs shows coral. And you'll be familiar with some of those organisms in that picture, I suspect. Zoologists put them in a phylum called the Cnidaria. Now, all members of the Cnidaria have certain characteristics in common. First off, they're all rather squishy. If you poke them with your finger, they'd be like jelly. And secondly, all of them have cells which are specialized in stinging to capture their food, because all of them capture small organisms from the water using these stinging cells to inject poison and kill the animal they're feeding on. So that includes the corals. The corals are in this class called Anthozoa, and all the animals in the Anthozoa are dominated by a growth form called a polyp. And you're probably familiar with polyps. Here's a classic polyp, a sea anemone. So you've got this organism with lots of tentacles out the front end. And in the middle, where the tentacles are, you've got a mouth. In fact, that's the only opening. Everything goes in the mouth and wastes come out of the mouth. And as we'll see later, the reproductive cells come out of the mouth. So corals consist of lots and lots of these polyps. Related organisms are organisms like jellyfish, and they're dominated by a growth form called a medusa. So a medusa, it's like a bell shape with tentacles coming out the bottom end, floating around in the water. And there's another class here, which includes the Portuguese man-of-war, which you might have heard of, which many people think is a jellyfish, but a Portuguese man-of-war is in a completely different class, and they're really colonies, and the colonies have polyps and medusa all together in this organism which we call the Portuguese man-of-war. Anyway, main point, corals are related to these other familiar organisms. Here's a single polyp, tentacles covered with these stinging cells, the mouth, the stomach, 2 layers of cells, with the jelly-like material in between these two layers of cells. So food goes in here, waste products come out of here. Lots of polyps seen from the top. Each polyp might be between 1 and 3 millimeters in diameter. So each one's very small, but as you're probably aware, they divide and form huge colonies. And each polyp is connected to the next one by a very thin layer of tissue. But if you broke off one polyp, it could survive as a single animal. So they form colonies. Some corals, not all of them, secrete calcium carbonate, and a form of calcium carbonate called aragonite. And they secrete the calcium carbonate at the rear end of the animal. So the tentacles are stuck up in the water. Down here is where they secrete the calcium carbonate, which is going to form these huge calcium carbonate reefs, which again, you're familiar with. Here's the aragonite. So imagine those polyps, each one would sit in one of these circles on top of the calcium carbonate, which it's secreted. And growth rates are up to something like 10 millimeters per year upwards. So year after year after year, calcium carbonate building and building and building. So yeah, I was just thinking, rather than making a landscape, they're major seascape contributors, contributing to the seascape. You can think of them in that way. Now, we're going to see that there are shallow water corals in the warm water at the surface of the ocean, and also deep water corals which live in very cold water. Let's think initially about the shallow water reef building corals, which we're more familiar with. So most of these, as well as eating animals, capturing animals from the water, also contain algae within their cells, photosynthetic algae. These are called zooxanthellae, and they give the color to the coral. So this golden color is made up of hundreds of thousands of these individual single cells called zooxanthellae. Microscopic, each one is what? Well, that scale is 1/25 of a millimeter. And they are capturing sunlight, making sugars in photosynthesis, just like plants on land. And in this case, they're transferring that sugar to the coral polyp. So these shallow water reef building corals get about 90% of their food from these photosynthetic algae. Only about 10% or less comes from capturing animals from the water column. So they're really important for the health of these warm water corals. They can escape, they can be released from the polyp, and then they swim around in the water as single cells. And when you look at these down the microscope, this is what they look like, each single cell with two what are called flagella, which are like whips, which thrash around and allow them to swim through the water. And this identifies them as a type of alga called a dinoflagellate. Have any of you heard of dinoflagellates? Ah, John has, well done. People have often heard of dinoflagellates and diatoms. Have you heard of diatoms? Yeah. Yay. Major phytoplankton in the oceans. So the free living and in a symbiotic, what we call a mutualistic symbiotic association with the polyp, because they're providing organic carbon food to the polyp, and the polyp, its waste, its nitrogenous and phosphorus containing waste are then absorbed by the algae. And there's really tight recycling of these nutrients within the polyp. So these reef building corals are often surrounded by really nutrient poor water. But the nutrients they do contain, it's a bit like in a rainforest. Most of the nutrients are in the trees. The tree falls over, it decomposes, the nutrients are released immediately back into vegetation, and the soils are very low in nutrients. So the waters where these warm water reef building corals are very low in nutrients, but the nutrients are really tightly recycled in the polyp animal. And this makes coral reefs highly productive. So you might have heard of bleaching of corals. Have any of you heard of that phenomenon? Yeah, most of you, because it's been in the news, increasingly so in recent years. So when the zooxanthellae are expelled from the polyp, that's when you get bleaching. So the color here, healthy coral, this is a bleached coral, it's lost its zooxanthellae. It's not necessarily dead, it's just lost those photosynthetic cells. Sorry?
Why are they expelled?
We'll get on to that. It can be warming water, or if the coral gets stressed in all sorts of ways, it can expel the zooxanthellae. If it doesn't regain the zooxanthellae, then it will quite rapidly die. How do they reproduce? Well, this is a diagrammatic coral covered with thousands and thousands of these polyps. The polyps can reproduce asexually just by dividing and staying in the colony, so the colony gets bigger and bigger. They can reproduce simply by fragmenting into little bits, and then the fragment, if it lands somewhere where it can attach and colonize, it will then regrow. So that's all what we call asexual reproduction, but then they've got sexual reproduction as well, with the production of sperm and eggs. So sperm, eggs released into the water, usually huge amounts, fertilization, and then that fertilized cell grows into a tiny little, it's called a planula, a little multicellular stage, which swims around in the water, then settles, if it can find a suitable substratum to settle on, develops into new polyps, develops into a new colony. So here we've got sexual reproduction. Individual colonies can be male or male and female. There are all sorts of variations on the theme. But here one is releasing billions and billions of sperm cells. This one, female, releasing eggs or packets of eggs. This is called broadcast spawning. And often it only happens once a year. And the corals can detect environmental change. They can detect changes in day length. They can detect changes in the temperature of the water. And by those cues, they know when the day has arrived for them to release their reproductive cells. And then they can detect the sun when it just goes below the horizon. And that's when they release their sexual cells into the water. So mass release, fertilization, these are the planula. They swim around for a few days, settle, then form a new polyp, which might grow into a new colony. Right. All my titles are going to be covered by that, I think. a bit unfortunate, but not to worry. This is just a simple diagram to show that there are different types of coral reef. Of course, we love classifying things, don't we? So first off, the ones we're all familiar with. Thanks, Norda. Yeah, that's much better. Thank you. Shallow warm water reefs. So these are the subtropical, tropical waters, 23 to 29 degrees centigrade. And different types, fringe reefs around the coast of continents or the coast of islands, platform reefs growing in relatively shallow water, barrier reefs at the edge of a continental shelf, reefs on the top of seamounts, often forming atolls. Obviously, the Pacific Ocean, really noted for its coral atolls. So those are the shallow water ones, mostly in water just down to 40 meters depth. And then you've got the deep cold water reefs. Now these can go down to 6,000 meters, 6 kilometers deep, where the water's really cold. In Antarctica, it's around about -1 degree centigrade. You find corals there. So cold water ones, water -1 to 12 degrees centigrade, 200 to 6,000 meters. And in between, relatively recently, they've recognize this sort of in-between category called a mesophotic reef. Oh, I should have mentioned, these deep ones obviously don't get any sunlight. The sunlight doesn't penetrate, so they're completely dependent on capturing food. They don't have zooxanthellae. The mesophotic ones can grow down to very low light levels. So some of them have zooxanthellae, increasing numbers don't. And they're in deepish water, very dim light, somewhat cooler temperatures. We'll mention them again towards the end if we get round to it. Oops, why isn't it changing? Ah. Yay, thank you. Quickly, just a few photographs of some of those reef types I've mentioned. This is obviously a fringing reef right up to the coast. This is a barrier reef. This is the Great Barrier Reef off the east coast of Australia, at the edge of the continental shelf. So really deep water beyond, shallower water on the continental shelf where the reef has developed. And this is obviously an atoll at the top of a seamount. It might be a volcano, an extinct volcano. And the idea is, as the volcano seamount sinks, or as the sea level rises, the coral grows and grows and grows and keeps up with the level of the seawater in the illuminated water and forms an atoll. So here's a good example. Eniwetok atoll in the Marshall Islands, a huge atoll. It's about 40 kilometers in diameter. So imagine the seamount down below. This is the central lagoon. Seamount in water, oh, I don't know how deep, but it would be several kilometers deep, this mountain going down to the bottom of the sea. And the coral, the living coral, just forms that very thin layer, a few millimeters thick, on top of all the calcium carbonate, which it has deposited over the centuries, over maybe the thousands of years. So this is where they are seascape architects. They're making a huge structure, which is going to be colonized by thousands, tens of thousands of other types of organisms. So they're providing living space for a huge diversity of other organisms. And that they've drilled down through the coral on top of the seamount and found it's 1,400 meters, 1.5 kilometers deep, that this thin layer of living polyps has deposited over that huge period of time. Lagoon in the middle, somewhat shallower, with there'll be a living coral in the lagoon as well. So all that white is the aragonite, the calcium carbonate, which the coral has laid down. Here's the classic example, of course, the Great Barrier Reef. We're always hearing, you know, the biggest living structure on Earth that can be seen from space. I'm sure there are lots of other living structures that can be seen on space. If you can read the headlines of a newspaper using a satellite, they can visualize each of you when you're walking around the campus. So, but yep, here we are. Oops, the Great Barrier Reef off the east coast of Australia. Some of you, have any of you been swimming? Yeah, one or two of you. I wish I had, but I haven't. And there's the barrier reef. But then there are platform reefs between the barrier and the coast, and there are fringing reefs along the coast. So it stretches for 2,300 kilometers, hugely diverse. We'll get onto this theme again shortly. 600 coral species on the Great Barrier Reef and over 1,500 different fish species. So photograph of just a small area here showing the islands, which will all be surrounded by reef, showing the barrier reef, and there'll be fringing reefs off the coast, and then a closer view of the actual barrier reef with the deep ocean water just beyond. And you think of the barrier reef, and I was thinking, when did it start growing? How long has it been there? Because of course, sea level has gone up and down hugely since, what, for the last 1.5 million years. The Pleistocene ice ages, we've gone from a glacial to an interglacial to a glacial to an interglacial. Sea level's gone up and down by about 120 meters. And apparently the Great Barrier Reef, the first evidence they have of it is something like 600,000 years ago. It started forming in the north of Australia. And Australia was still slowly drifting north, still is, a continental drift, climate changing. But during the glacials, when all the water's on the ice caps, Antarctica and the northern ice cap, sea level is about 120 meters shallower. So 20,000 years ago, it was something like this. There's the continental shelf. That would be the barrier reef. That would be a platform reef. These are fringing reefs. But there's no living coral. The water's gone. It's dead. When did the water come back? When the climate started warming after the depth of the last ice age? Well, it started about 20,000 years ago, getting warmer. So sea level started to rise. And they've got evidence that the coral started regrowing just something like 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. So the sea had come back in and the coral starts growing again on the top of the limestone mounds, the limestone reefs. Sea level keeps going up by a few tens of meters from about 9,000 years ago, and the coral keeps growing. So the deposited calcium carbonate gets deeper and deeper as the sea level slowly goes up. So that's the situation now. What's going to happen in the future? If sea level increase accelerates, is the coral going to keep up? If we were plunged into another ice age, which looks increasingly unlikely, sea level would go down again very rapidly and the coral would die. And we'll come back to that again later as well. A bit about the diversity. We've already seen Great Barrier Reef, about 600 species of coral. So they come in all different shapes and sizes. Stag's horn coral, you can imagine the common names, elkhorn coral, table coral, what was that one? Pillar coral, obvious names. Just gives you an idea of some of the diversity. So 3, 6, 7, 8 examples, mushroom coral, 8 examples there of ones which secrete calcium carbonate and form reefs. But these coral reefs are also colonized by so-called soft corals. These don't deposit deep layers of calcium carbonate. They just have tiny little spicules of calcium carbonate in their tissue, and they're quite soft and they flap around in the currents, but they don't contribute to the reef formation, but they're important in the biodiversity. So we're still with warm water corals, rich biodiversity. The normal statistic which you see if you go to websites or Greenpeace or the Worldwide Fund for Nature or whatever, they say something like 32% of all marine species of animals and seaweeds occur around warm water corals. 32%, that's a third of marine diversity around these warm water corals. Now, why is that? It's because the calcium carbonate forming coral species form a home for many other species in different parts of that coral reef. So suprabenthic, technical term, all it means is above the bottom. Benthic means the bottom surface, things that live above the bottom, like the fish. So fish are really diverse. Globally, something like 4,000 species of reef fish. 840 and more reef-building warm water corals. So we've got the suprabenthic organisms, fish, octopus, whatever, other things as well. We've got the sessile epibenthic, more terminology, sessile, sitting up on the bottom, so attached to the bottom surface. Whole wide range, hard and soft corals, sponges, algae, etc., etc. But even more important in the biodiversity is the cryptofauna. So crypto means hidden. You don't see them because they're hiding in little crevices, caves and holes, the interstitial cracks and crevices of that big reef. And you've got all these, ones that actively bore into the reef, sponges, worms, bivalves, ones which are sessile, just sitting there, attached to the calcium carbonate, a whole wide range. And I love this one, the motile nestlers. They sound really friendly, but some of them would probably bite your finger off if you poke your hole in one of these little caves. Crustaceans, worms, starfish and mollusks. So overall, something like, and new species are being found all the time, of course, that many corals, that many fish, getting on for 1 million other animals and seaweeds. And then when you get into the microbiology, which is my interest, very briefly, they're now doing molecular genetic studies of microbial diversity. So comparing the DNA that you can extract from the organisms. And this recent study, 2023, Pacific reefs have something like 500,000 microbes. And if you extrapolated that, made an estimate, I haven't experimentally actually got this data, this is an extrapolation, they reckon there'd be something like 3 million different microbes associated with coral reefs worldwide. And that pretty much doubles the number of bacteria and related organisms known globally at the moment. So this just stresses the rich biodiversity associated with coral reefs. This is an earlier study, 2002, but again, it demonstrates the same theme, the high biodiversity, and it gives you some idea about where the centers of biodiversity are. Because each of these, I hope you can see, is a world map. There's Aussie, tip of Aotearoa just about showing, South America. And the hotter colors show more species. So this is called the coral triangle. This is really the center of biodiversity when it comes to warm water coral reefs. 500 and more species of fish. Caribbean, another major area of reefs, has got somewhat lesser diversity, maybe up to 300 fish, but it shows you this patchy diversity globally. So if you're into conservation of biodiversity, it's giving you some clues on perhaps where to focus your activity. So it's the same for fish, corals, snails and lobsters, the chosen animals that they used in this study, with the center of biodiversity in the subtropics and tropics, north of Australia and south of Southeast Asia. And all these species, of course, have different roles in the environment. So you can imagine the complexity of what we'd call a food web. Where does the carbon flow? What eats what? What decomposes what? Hugely complex. Very simply, just some examples. This is called a striped surgeon fish. It must have very sharp teeth, but that's a herbivore, so it eats algae. This one's a parrotfish, and again, it's got very sharp teeth. This eats the coral, so it goes around scraping the surface of the coral, and it eats the polyps and the zooxanthellae, and in its intestines, it grinds down the calcium carbonate, which comes out its rear end as sand. So those beautiful white sandy beaches, which you might find associated with coral reefs, where people go swimming down from the shoreline, you probably wouldn't have them, or they wouldn't be so abundant in sand if it wasn't for the parrotfish. And then other fish are predators of these. So these are all acting together to result in the sort of quasi-stability of the coral reef ecosystem. All that activity going on, but the whole thing remaining relatively stable. What else? Giant clams. You know, you hear about those. Oh, if you put your foot in, it'll go clunk and hold you down there in the deep water and you'll drown. But apparently that's not the case because they close about this speed or even slower. So don't worry, you can put your hand in, feel the soft flesh. These have zooxanthellae as well. That's why they're wide open most of the time, open to the sunlight. So a bit like the coral polyps. And other animals, iconic animals like turtles. And this particular species, again, eats the algae, which is good because if the algae grow too much, they shade out the zooxanthellae in the coral, which can lead to death of the coral. So huge biodiversity, very briefly on human benefit. And so much of this is just so obvious, intuitively obvious, isn't it? If we didn't have coral reefs, or if they all disappeared, how would human populations cope? So, yeah, many people, getting on for 300 million people in many countries, living close to coral reefs, warm water coral reefs. And of course, one of the major environmental benefits is that they reduce the wave energy. If you have a cyclone, turbulent water offshore, big waves coming in, a lot of that energy can be dissipated over the reef, in the shallow water over the reef. So they reckon reducing the energy of the waves by up to 97%. So this helps make them a natural flood defense over that huge length of shoreline, 71,000 kilometers, helping to protect millions of people. Tourism. I'm a bit iffy about tourism. You know, how do people get to all these Pacific islands or get to the Maldives, beautiful Maldive Islands off the southern tip of India? They fly there. They're worried about sea level rise. Sea level rise might harm the reefs. But these countries become increasingly dependent on international tourism. There's a certain rub there, isn't there? I can't completely get my mind around it. But they reckon 350 million people each year traveling to reefs. A couple of folk here swimming on the Great Barrier Reef. Big tourism value. I no longer know whether 36 billion is a big number or not. We're hearing about trillions of dollars now, aren't we? 36 billion maybe doesn't sound all that much. I don't know. It's a lot of money for some people, for some societies perhaps, but how much of it stays in the Pacific Islands or stays in the Maldives? I don't know. And of course, the fisheries. Large proportion of the fish caught in these tropical countries. And again, people try and put a dollar value on it to make us interested in it. I don't think we always need the dollar value. It's obviously important to people, a key part of their diet in the Pacific Islands. So obviously corals are important. And this has been a big focus in the last 2 or 3 decades. Bioprospecting, taking a species, looking at the chemicals it produces, can they be of value for human benefit? So a few examples, these are sponges which grow on coral reefs, and they have apparently extracted certain compounds which are active in killing cancer cells. Maybe not yet to the treatment level, but maybe in the lab, at the lab level. Other ones might have been developed. This is a soft coral. Now, what did this produce? A chemical of medical interest. as does the cone shell. Highly poisonous cone shells. They have a little sort of harpoon structure in them, which they fire at their prey, and it injects a really toxic poison, which can rapidly kill people. But in its diluted state, that chemical can act as a painkiller for people who have become resistant to opiates. So opiates, the last painkiller in the array of painkillers for people in great pain. There's now this one for people who can't tolerate the use of opiates. So this is still a big area of research, of course. Right, that's the warm water corals. I hope I've got time. Oh yeah, gosh, got 20 minutes. Phew. Cold water corals. Did you all realize that there are cold water corals? No. They're hugely widespread, hugely biodiverse, even more so than the warm water corals. So these are the ones down into kilometre deep water where it's dark. So they've got to capture little animals. And this one is a key one because, again, this is a reef building deep water coral called Lophelia pertusa. There's a diver there looking at the edge of one of these cold water coral reefs. That's a close-up of the polyps. And this shows from a few meters distance what the colonies look like. That's a different sort of coral. That's called a gorgonian. So we've got cold water, reef building, deep water corals, and they're really widespread. This is just one example. How long was the Great Barrier Reef? 2,300 kilometers, I think, a string of coral reef. Here's a string of coral reefs, which is over 4,000 kilometers long. From the tip of Norway, down the coast of Scandinavia, round the top of Scotland, off the west coast of Ireland, through the Bay of Biscay, down the coast of Spain, around St. Paul's Rocks in mid-Atlantic, off the south coast of Iceland, and down the mid-Atlantic ridge, especially up here just south of Iceland. There aren't red circles elsewhere because those areas probably haven't been investigated sufficiently. So really widespread. They even occur in the Norwegian fjords. And this is a diagram from a book. Imagine diving in the water here, and the water's very deep. Those cliffs continue precipitously down into the fjord. Well, down at the bottom, this is where the depth, the bottom rounds off at the bottom of the fjord. Down at the bottom there, you've got all these cold water corals forming big mounds of calcium carbonate, and with lots of other organisms associated with them. Now, because these are in cold water, they grow even slower than those warm water corals. And this is just one estimate that's been made. These corals, these are off Hawaii. Oh yeah, it says Hawaiian Islands. Relatively shallow, 400 meters depth, probably a temperature of about 10 degrees centigrade. This is a cross section through a stem of a coral of this sort. And it's got rings, a bit like a tree. You cut down a tree, you've got the annual rings. Well, these corals have annual rings. This is an actual coral viewed using ultraviolet light, which shows up these rings. And that's how fast they grow, how much calcium carbonate they lay down each year. Tiny, tiny amount. About 0.02 of a millimeter. That's 20 micrometers per year. So if you can see the stem of the coral, it's taken a long time to get that big. Gold coral getting on for 3,000 years old, black coral over 4,000 years old, in its older portions where the stem's thicker. So you can imagine disturbance of these, like cutting down a huge tree, I don't know, in New Zealand, what, a red beech, 1,000 years old. Cut it down, you've lost a 1,000-year-old tree. Get rid of one of those corals, you've lost a 2, 3, 4,000-year-old coral. What might cause damage in such deep water? Well, New Zealand has got these deep water corals. So this is from a 2012 publication. And all the black shading is the estimate based on a few samples from different depths, an estimate of where these different coral types occur around New Zealand's waters. The green is where the bottom has been really thoroughly trawled by the fisheries. So trawling over the bottom just wipes out the coral pretty much. But as you can see, these cold-water corals hugely widespread in our waters, the different types. Now the circles and the squares, that one there is a seamount where trawling is forbidden. So there are a few protected areas. And the areas with the sort of purplish line around them, activity on the bottom is restricted as well. So there is a certain level of protection, but of course there's still a huge amount of fishing and trawling going on, both in New Zealand waters and New Zealand trawlers in the Tasman Sea and in the Pacific Ocean. We're one of the very few nations, apparently, which still allows bottom trawl nets. Deep water corals in Antarctica. These found relatively recently in the Weddell Sea. Here's the Weddell Sea, just offshore. So they'd be offshore from the ice shelf. Weddell Sea, several hundred meters deep down to the continental shelf. On the bottom, these are soft corals, and this is a bed of hard corals with starfish, and there's an octopus there as well. So really, people don't think of Antarctica having such rich life on the bottom of the ocean, but it has, as it has rich life in the waters above. And again, the biodiversity of these deep water, cold water corals is huge. 3,300 coral species, they reckon, of which only a small proportion are reef builders. Those 20 species are the ones which, well, another terminology I think that's used is ecological engineers. They engineer their own environment. Sorry?
Sorry, why not architect?
Oh, sorry. Well. I'm sure you can get in the act, especially later on with restoration of reefs. So, yep, lots of coral species, fish associated, little invertebrate animals associated, for the same reason as those warm water corals, because this is the sort of structure they build. Look at the scale. Mounds of coral, calcium carbonate, up to 300 meters high. Imagine that, 300 meters. And the base up to 5 kilometers diameter. So you could have one of these on your campus, or even bigger than your campus, couldn't you? A mound of calcium carbonate, 300 meters high, with all these other organisms. So you've got the living coral over the surface, wide range of organisms. Underneath the living coral, you've got the dead coral and holes in it and caves, hundreds to thousands of other species, and then bits of coral roll off and form rubble around the edge, and you've got different species again associated with the coral rubble. So the biodiversity there comes out as much greater than in the surrounding muddy sediments. So again, warm water coral, cold water coral, centers of biodiversity. So where are they found worldwide? Well, the red dots, subtropical, tropical, shallow water, warm water corals that we've talked about. The blue dots are the cold deep water corals on seamounts in deep water. A global distribution. I took out a slide actually estimating the number of seamounts worldwide. And this other picture, a map like this, with 14,000 known large seamounts. So these dots here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seamounts with deep water corals. They're the ones that have been examined. There are 14,000 other big seamounts. If you include smaller mountains and hills, apparently there are about 100,000 of them, which might have this biota associated with them. So the blue dots could be much more scattered than shown on that last picture. But from what we know, what total area of the ocean contains this 32% of all marine biodiversity? So world ocean, 360 million kilometers, all the blue on that squashed earth. Warm water reefs, 260,000 square kilometers. Estimate of cold water reefs, about the same. So total reef area getting on for 500,000 square kilometers in a total of 360 million square kilometers. So the reefs, known reefs, cover about that area. And they contain 32%, they reckon, of marine biodiversity. So the total area misrepresents their importance. Now, very quickly, a bit about their evolution. How long have they been around? What sort of conditions have they survived in the past? Well, the first fossils are in the Cambrian, about 550 million years ago, a fair time ago. Then they became extinct. That's a photograph of the Cambrian environment. Well, an artist's imagination. That's a trilobite, and I presume maybe these are the corals. Then they went extinct. They're no longer in the fossil record. Then what appear to be stony corals arise again in the Ordovician and the Devonian, right up to the Permian. And this is what the undersea environment might have looked like. Starfish, squid-like animals. These are called sea tulips. You can still see those in Littleton Harbour, sea tulips. And some of these are the reefs. And then they went extinct about 250 million years ago. The Permian Triassic major extinction. Something happened. Things got mighty hot. They went extinct. And then a new type of coral arose in the fossil record. Getting on for 250 million years ago, 240 million years ago. And this group of corals has maintained its presence right to the present. So these are the modern types of corals. And now there are lots of fish in the sea and other animals which have evolved. But these modern stony corals have survived over about 240 million years. What sort of conditions have all these corals been through? Well, this is an estimate of the average global surface temperature, the average of the whole globe. Currently, our current average is about 15. Pre-industrial was about 13.5, the average global temperature. At certain periods, and quite often when there's been a mass extinction like well, those two are main ones, the temperature's gone really high. Average global temperatures above 30 degrees centigrade, above 30 degrees centigrade, presently 15, average. So in some places it was much hotter, some places, thankfully, it was still somewhat cooler. So life survived. Up and down, up and down, up and down through the millions of years. Oh, 5 minutes. Oh my God. So even these modern stony corals, at times, the average global temperature has been above 30 degrees centigrade. How about carbon dioxide? Well, this is an estimate based on pretty good evidence of CO2 levels in the atmosphere over the last, 60 odd million years. Presently, we've got 425 parts per million. Pre-industrial was about 270, 280. But that's the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, that peak there of temperature, about 1,600 parts per million of CO2. And these corals survived through that, through the very warm temperatures and the high CO2. These are the modern corals. This is how they evolved and diversified. Question marks, what's happening now? What's going to happen over the next 10, 20, 100, 200 years? We don't know. Things are warming, more CO2 in the atmosphere, etc. So the future, global change taking place, warming, acidification, sea level rise, and all sorts of regional and local changes happening in the environment. Let's look at global change quickly. Sea surface temperatures going up. They've gone up about 1 degree centigrade since about 1940, 1950. Doesn't sound much, but it's a huge amount of heat in the oceans. So what effect is this having on those warm water corals? Well, they've been monitoring this for about, they reckon they've got 73 years of data, 10 regions of the Earth, 2 million observations, and they produce a report, 2020, Status of Coral Reefs of the World, the International Coral Reef Initiative. So here we've got time, 1980 to 2020, the area of living hard coral in all their monitoring sites worldwide. So the sites on average had something like 32% coral cover. Pretty stable, 1998, mass bleaching, loss of coral. So this is death of coral. It recovered somewhat, 2010, mass bleaching, loss of coral. And that loss of coral was the equivalent of getting on for 12,000 square kilometers of coral, about 13% of the total area. That's up to 2020. This is sea surface temperature. 1998 loss, a peak in sea surface temperature, bleaching of the coral, lots of those zooxanthellae. 2010, the same happened, a peak, loss of coral. Again, over that period, loss of coral. 2020, it looks as though it's starting to recover, but we're only up to 2020. Algae, the cover of algae, and this is an average globally, increased somewhat by about 5%. Not all that much, but it looks like a definite increase as the coral was lost. So these algae growing where the coral used to be. 2023-24, off that, beyond that previous graph, just last year, huge mass bleaching. Water temperatures reached a record high. So January to December, average seawater temperature in the subtropics and the tropics, all the years between 79 and 2022, the annual temperature was within that blue area. 2023, it went beyond, 224, even further beyond. So you got a mass bleaching. This is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. What's happening to them at the moment? What is dear President Trump? Yeah, they're losing workers left, right, and centre. But they produce maps predicting what will happen to the coral at certain water temperatures. So this was for that mass bleaching. In the Great Barrier Reef Pacific area, these colours, risk of multi-species mortality, risk of reef-wide bleaching. In the Caribbean area, these purple categories, risk of severe multi-species mortality, risk of near complete mortality in the Caribbean with those higher temperatures. I will leap on, sorry, because otherwise I don't want to keep you. I'm sure I couldn't keep you. 49. 4, 9, enter. Phew. So things happening at the global level. At the regional level, all these pressures on the coral. Nutrient increase, sediment deposition, overfishing, diseases, etc. So all these aspects, this is human applied stress on those marine ecosystems. This is in the Red Sea. They're going to build, the Saudi Arabians putting billions and billions and billions of dollars or whatever into a huge new tourist development in the Red Sea. What effect will that have on sediment runoff, on nutrient runoff, etc.? Australia, tropical, subtropical regions in Queensland, agriculture, increasing flooding, nutrient sediment going into the ocean. So you get overgrowth of the coral with algae. Crown of thorns, a starfish which eats the coral. You're getting these plagues of crowns of thorn. These are diseases. This one's caused by bacteria. This is dead coral. This is living coral. That's the disease spreading outwards. This is bleached coral caused by a disease due to a protozoan. Harvesting of coral for jewelry, harvesting of coral for ornaments, overfishing, for instance, in Malaysia, petrol, sodium, ammonium nitrate fertilizer in a beer bottle, put a time fuse in, light the fuse, lob it into the water, 10 seconds later, bang, collect the fish. Physical damage to the coral, although they're trying to police it and control it. So these are all regional pressures on the coral. Yep, trawling as well. New Zealand trawler trawled up a coral. This led to it being banned from trawling. Now, who said this? This is last year. It's a 37 kilogram bunch of coral. I wouldn't fuss about it too much. We can't pretend that coral is more important than GDP. Who said that? Come on. Shane Jones? Yeah? Now, I suspect my time is up. So, oh, thank you very much. But I'll dash to my final slide because, yep, having talked about the global environmental change, which is stressing coral, and all these local changes, which are stressing coral, what I've had to miss out on is one slide about restoration of coral. There's huge efforts being made to restore coral reefs in Florida, in Malaysia, in the Maldives Islands. Huge efforts, millions and millions of dollars, lots of people, all sorts of techniques. But the biggest restoration project I've seen described is one in Florida, which aims to restore the coral over, I think it was 25 hectares of coral. That's a tiny area. Previous graph, 11,000, 12,000 square kilometers lost. And that's before the 2023-24 bleaching. So it's great, people are trying to restore, like they're trying to restore mangroves and seagrass beds and forests. It's great, it's having an effect, but it's small scale. So what have we got to do? These impacts are reducing the resilience of the coral to global change. So the first thing we can do really is reduce these local regional impacts. And this will help increase the resilience of the coral to global change. It seems that we are having an effect on the coral, despite, some evidence from the past, from the evolution, that the group as a whole has been through these massive environmental changes, huge rises in temperature, huge rises in CO2, which acidify the ocean. They've survived through that. But then their recovery apparently was over millions of years. So, okay, we can take action to increase resilience to global change, but really the most important, and for so many other reasons as well, is to reduce our emissions quickly and deeply. You know, you're familiar with this, you've all seen these graphs. Atmospheric CO2 rapidly rising, still is. And of course, that's driving global surface temperature increase. Nothing, it hasn't got to anything like the 30 degrees, thank heavens, that even happened, what, 55 million years ago. The Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. Look it up on Google. Lots of information. Fascinating stuff. But even these changes, as you know, are impacting on biodiversity, on the stability of natural ecosystems worldwide, including the coral. So hopefully we can do things and yeah, allow these seascape architects, these natural seascape architects, to continue sort of inspiring us with their beauty and diversity and providing all those benefits. I'm sure we can if we do the right thing on a large enough scale, you know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.